Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, the world's worst pest threatens food security in Eastern Africa. Huge swarms of locusts are devastating crops. Also, the UN wants an independent investigation into the killing of around 24 villagers in an English-speaking region in Cameroon last week. The army denies having been careless with the lives of 23 civilians. And in DR Congo, President Tshisekedi's promised sheep jump overpasses in Kinshasa get off to an underwhelming start after his first year in office. A lack of funding and suspicions of mismanagement lead to construction efforts making traffic even worse in the city. But first, an ongoing plague of desert locusts is devastating crops in East Africa. The insects are the most dangerous of all migratory pests. Swarms have spread through Kenya, Somalia, Tanzania, Eritrea and Djibouti. And on Tuesday, some crossed back into Uganda after having briefly entered South Sudan. Now, the invasion poses a serious threat to food security in a region where up to 25 million people are already struggling to get enough to eat after 3 years of drought, floods, and in South Sudan's case, at least, civil war. Well, Keith Cressman helps deal with outbreaks like this for the UN's Food and Agricultural Organization. He joins me now with more. Keith, thanks very much for speaking to me. First of all, for those who may never have encountered a swarm of locusts, which I imagine would be the majority of people, it's very hard to understand the scale of damage that they can cause. So tell us more about why they are so dangerous, particularly in countries heavily reliant on agriculture.
Well, you have to imagine, first of all, how big a swarm of desert locusts can be. It looks like a cloud kind of on the horizon. So if you're a farmer that's depending on rainfall for your crop and you see that cloud, you think it's rainfall until it moves closer to you, and it's millions and millions of insects. And just a single swarm of locusts, let's say the size of Paris, can eat the same amount of food in one day as half of France. Or if we do a similar analogous, that of the size of Rome can eat the same amount of food as everybody in Kenya. So the potential of these swarms is absolutely devastating, and it's already affecting an area of Africa that's very, very vulnerable.
With this vulnerability, I imagine that countries in Eastern Africa struggle to be properly equipped to deal with this threat.
Well, absolutely. I mean, Somalia and Ethiopia, they haven't seen such a situation for a quarter of a century. Kenya hasn't seen this for 70 years. So, of course, there's no established national structures that are able to quickly respond and effectively respond to this threat. Those swarms that you mentioned that entered South Sudan yesterday and then re-entered Uganda, both countries haven't seen swarms since 1961. So it's very difficult to quickly respond and upscale those much needed control efforts in order to protect the livelihoods and the food security of people in the Horn of Africa.
So many of the country now worst affected, as you've mentioned, haven't seen swarms like this or of this size in decades. So what has changed? Why are they seeing so many locusts suddenly this year?
Well, of course, it's not a sudden event, is it? You just don't wake up and see swarms out your window in the morning. They've been developing for the last year and a half, since 2018. And in that year, there were two cyclones, one in May and one in October of that year. And these cyclones brought very heavy rain to another part of the world, to the Arabian Peninsula. And the locusts, they increased in that area for about 8,000 times in about 9 months. So there are huge swarms that formed. They were uncontrolled. Then they migrated to Yemen. They bred some more and then on to the Horn of Africa. Now, the result of this was these cyclones, in fact. And there was a cyclone at the end of December in the Horn of Africa, exactly where the swarms are. We've noticed in the past 5 years an increase in the frequency of these cyclones off the Indian Ocean. So I think it goes to say, if this increase continues, and we know that cyclones trigger locust plagues, so if that increase does continue, then there's a chance, a very high probability, that the Horn of Africa, Arabia, and other countries will face desert locust upsurges and outbreaks like we have now.
Thank you very much, Keith Cressman there from the FAO, speaking to me from Rome. In other news, on his final stop on a visit to Africa that also took him to Senegal and Angola, the US Secretary of State on Tuesday pledged $8 million in aid to help with the locust outbreak that we just spoke about. Whilst in Ethiopia, Mike Pompeo also said that the US will provide financial assistance to Addis Ababa as it pushes political reforms under Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. Details on that support are still unclear. Pompeo has, though, called for the August 29th elections for the country to break from decades of repression, and Abiy's pledged that they will be free and fair. And Lesotho's First Lady, Maïssa Thabane, appeared in court on Tuesday as a magistrate set the date when she will stand trial for murder. That will happen on March 17th. Police accuse her of having hired 8 assassins to kill Prime Minister Thomas Thabane's estranged wife, Lipolelo. She was gunned down in Maseru in 2017. Maïssa denies involvement. And the UN wants an independent investigation into the killing of around 24 villagers in an English-speaking region in Cameroon last week. The bloodshed's the latest deadly incident in an area at the heart of a violent crisis over Anglophone identity in a country with a majority of people are French speakers. Indira Eteng tells us more.
Bamenda in the northwest region of Cameroon are still in shock following the killing of scores of people, including children and pregnant women, in clashes between the Cameroon army and pro-separatist fighters last Friday. The United Nations has called for an independent investigation into the violence and has said perpetrators of the killings should be held accountable. Meantime, opposition parties and rights groups in Cameroon have condemned the killings, which they have attributed to the Cameroon army. The Ministry of Defense denies the army is to blame. It, however, claims that only 5 civilians were killed in an unfortunate accident which was sparked by an explosion.
The Ministry of Defense firmly denies both the allegations and the numbers reported by the UN's office that completely go against what happened on the ground. The UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs has not been on the ground and cannot go there because of insecurity. I would like to stress that for our government forces, 1 death is already a lot. In all our operations, we make sure that surrounding areas and civilians are not affected. But unfortunately, this can happen.
Despite contradicting the casualties recorded so far in the Ngabu incident, the Ministry of Defense has called for investigations into the killings to be spearheaded by the Cameroon Gendarmerie. The country is still dealing with the military's harsh crackdown on an Anglophone separatist insurgency. Over 3 years since the Anglophone crisis started, about 3,000 lives have been lost and over 500,000 people have been forced from their homes by the crisis.
Indira Etting there for us. Now, Tunisia's president says that voters will have to head back to the polls for legislative elections if parliament cannot agree on a new government. The prime minister's list has been rejected by lawmakers. Yana Lee has the details.
He's calling it the country's worst political crisis since independence. Tunisian President Kais Saied warns that if Parliament cannot agree on the formation of a new government, then there will be fresh legislative elections.
If it comes to this, it is possible, as the Constitution stipulates, to resort to the people, since it is they who are sovereign. They grant and withdraw confidence to whomever they wish. The law and the Tunisian people have the final word.
Designated Prime Minister Social Democrat Elias Fakhfakh unveiled his lineup on Saturday, only for it to be rejected by the parliament's biggest party, Ennahda. The second largest party, Kalb Tunis, also dismissed the list as its choice for Prime Minister Nabil Karoui was sidelined. Tunisia has been without a government since last October's elections. The vote resulted in no outright majority in parliament. As the largest formation, moderate Islamists Ennahda were the first to try and form a government, but they failed to convince fellow MPs. Now, Fakhfakh has until February 20th to convince 109 lawmakers to vote for his proposal. If not, the country is heading towards its 4th legislative vote since the 2011 revolution.
In DR Congo, President Tshisekedi's plans for a bold first year in office marked by a complete overhaul of the roads has been underwhelming. The planned overpasses, known as sheep jumps, seem to have fallen at the first hurdle and made getting around Kinshasa even more difficult. Pierre Delrieux tells us more.
Endless traffic jams in downtown Kinshasa. Since Felix Tshisekedi became president a year ago, the length and cost of the daily commute has shot up for most locals.
Before I used less fuel, so now it has an impact on the cost of living and it's hard. I don't know how to deal with it.
For 18 years, I spent 500 francs to go from my home district to the city center. Now it costs me around 2,500 francs to go downtown. Others pay up to 3,500 francs.
President Tshisekedi had promised to build a series of overpasses known by locals as sheep jumps, meant to circumvent some of the capital's most congested boulevards. But more than a year after his inauguration, only 30% of the roadwork has been finished. The government says the delays are due to problems raising funds, but many suspect corruption is to blame. The holdup reflects badly on Tshisekedi. While still campaigning for office with his 100-day program, he had pledged to modernize the country and eradicate graft. But a national transparency watchdog believes that bribery, kickbacks and money squandering have only worsened under Tshisekedi.
We've asked the Prime Minister to halt any spending until a serious audit is carried out on the overpass project and on the entire 100-day program, because at this pace we're going to reach 100 million in spending in no time, and those 100 million are still managed by the same people.
On February 8th, the public prosecutor began investigating the delays in public works. They include the restoration of roads, but also schools and hospitals. 2 days later, the government allocated an additional $3.5 million to the roadworks, promising a revised completion date for the project of June 2020.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa. Thanks for joining us. Do so again if you can. Take care.